Hello, this is our first lesson for grade 6, day 1, lesson 8-1. First thing I'd like you to do is read through pages 334, 335, and the top of 336. So pause this video right now, do that, and then come back and let's talk about some example problems. Okay, we're back. One of the things that's going to be necessary in solving these problems is realizing that there are some percent to fraction equivalents that are very helpful if you know them. And so I would highly suggest you write these down on a piece of paper so that you don't have to be looking for them or figuring them out over and over again. It'd be nice to have these on a piece of paper. But let's get started with the example problems. The first one is the green dot problem on the bottom of 334 rather, labeled problem A, 26% of 80. I know that 26% is very close to 25%, which is the fraction 1/4. So I'm going to take 1/4 times, the word of in mathematics often means multiplication, times 80 over 1. I'm going to cross simplify, divide by 4, and that gives me 20 over 1, or just plain 20 for our first problem. Second problem, 75%. That's very close to 3/4. But 23 is kind of a hard number to work with in this, since we're supposed to be estimating and we don't need an exact answer. What I'm thinking about in my mind is, what can I change 23 to make it really easy to work with? And I realize that if I change it to 24, then I can cross simplify with this 4 very easily. And so I do that, and I get 18 over 1, or just plain 18 as our answer. Third example problem, 62. 62, that's really close to 5/8. It's also really close to 3/5. I'm going to think about this number for a second. What would that be close to that would be easy to work with? I'm going to start with that, change it to 500, because that's much easier to work with. And looking at these two values, I think it's easiest if I go to 3/5. Because 5 and 500 are easy to cross simplify. And when I do that, I get 300 over 1, or just plain 300. So these are the first types of problems that you're going to be facing using fractions to estimate, bottom of 334. The next type of problem is on the top of 335, and it's estimating by using 10%. And the first problem, that's a green dot problem on the top of 335, is 19% of 40. Now remember, they said estimating by using 10%. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to think about 10% of 40. 10% of means multiplication, and 10% is the fraction 1/10. What is 1/10 of 40? 1/10 of 40 is the number 4, right? So 10% of 40 is the number 4. But we're really wanting to solve for 19%. Realize that 19% is very close to 20%. And to get from 10 to 20, we'd multiply by 2. So we're going to do the same thing to this answer over here. 20% of 40 would equal 8. And that's our answer for this particular problem, 8. Example problem E on the top of 335 is 30% of 217. Well, again, we're trying to learn this method of 10% and use it to solve the problem. So I'm thinking 10% of 217, well, that's kind of hard to work with, that 217. So I'm going to change 217 to, how about 210? And 10% is again 1/10 of 210. Can I divide these both by 10? Yes. And I get an answer of 21. So 10% of this is 21. But I want it to be 30%. And that means multiplying by 3 to get from 10 down to 30. So I do the same thing to this number, and I get an answer of 63. 30% of 210 is 63. And that's our second problem in this set of estimating by using 10% of a number. Problem F says 63% of 91. Again, I'm going to think, because we're thinking about solving these by using 10% of the number, I'm going to think of 10% of 90. 90 is easier to work with than 91. 1/10 of 90 is the number 9, or 9 over 1. But remember, we want to have an answer for 63%. I'm going to change that 63 to 60 because it's easier to work with. And that's a case of multiplying by 6 to get from 10 to 60%. So I'm going to do the same thing to this 9, and I'm going to get an answer of 54. 60% of 90 is approximately 54. That's our second type of problem here. So the first type was estimating using fractions. Second type, estimating by using 10%. Now we've got the problems that are on the bottom of 335. Percents greater than 100 or percents smaller than 100. Here's our first example problem. Example problem G, green dot G, 174% of 200. Let's think of this as actually being two values brought together into one. I'm going to think of it as 100% of the 200, and I'm going to think of it as 75% of the 200. Notice I changed the 74 to 75 because it's going to be easier to work with that 3/4. 1 times 200 gives me 200. 3/4 of 200. Uh-oh, cross simplify. Divide by 4. Divide by 4. I get, what is that, 150? So what do I do with these now? Well, I add them together, and I get an answer of 350. So 174% of 200 is 350. Second example problem, 298% of 45. Well, looking at this, I'm thinking to myself, that's really close to 300%. So why don't I think of it that way? And then I can say to myself, well, 300% is really 300 over 100, and let's multiply it by this 45. Now, can't we simplify this and think of it as just simply 3 over 1 if I divide the top and the bottom by 100? And then when I multiply these together, I get an answer of 135. The next type of problem, example problem green dot I, says 0.25% of 785. Nope, I'm sorry, of 789. Realize, please, that this percent is smaller than the number 1%. So the first thing I think about in regards to solving this kind of a problem is, what would the answer be if it was 1% of, and I'm going to estimate this to be about 800, what would 1% of 800 be? Well, that's the same thing as 1 over 100 times 800 over 1. I can cross simplify, and I get an answer of 8. Now, knowing that 1% of 789 is about 8 helps me to think through what this is going to be as an answer. I know that 0.25%, when I compare it to the number 1, it's off by a factor of 4. I have to take this times 4 to get to here. This times 4 gets me to 1%. So that means that this answer is 4 times bigger than it needs to be. In other words, if I want to change from this to 0.25% of 800, I actually have to divide by 4. And so the answer to this problem becomes the number 2. 2 is really 0.25% of 789 if we're thinking about an estimated answer. One more example problem of this type. What about, say, 0.5% of 602? I would first think about what is 1% of 600. 1% of 600 would be 6 over 1, or 6, because I could cross simplify by dividing by 100. Now, think about 0.5% and 1%. 0.5 is exactly half of 1. 0.5 is half of 1. So my answer in this particular case, when I think of 0.5% of 600, I'm actually taking my answers and dividing by 2 to get what 0.5% of 600 is. If 1% of 600 is the number 6, then 0.5% of 600 is the number 3, because this is about half of this. Hope this helps you. If you get stuck on any of the problems, call me on the phone, 517-242-3138. Thank you.